Today we're in Psalm chapter 13. It's a great psalm. Let me read it because it's just a few verses. But I want to suggest to you before the reading of the text that I encourage you to have a personal diary of prayer with the background of the prayers of the Psalms. Because in the Psalms, is facing about every circumstance one can face in life, and it will be a tremendous help, you see, when you're facing the same kind of circumstances, whether they be good or bad. So, Psalm chapter 13 today, and I want you to think about how you pray in this particular psalm, because oftentimes we find ourselves in the very same situations. Now, I'm going to break it down into a theological problem, verse 1 and 2, and an internal problem, that is the struggles that go within ourselves, and then the outward or the outside problem or the circumstances that David is facing. So let's begin in verse 1 through 6, and then we'll look at the psalm in a little bit more depth. How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord, forever? How long will thou hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel? Some translations have wrestle in my soul, having in my heart daily this sorrow. How long shall my enemy be exalted or seem to be triumphant over me? Verse number 3, consider and hear me, O Lord my God, lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. In verse number 4, David goes on to say, lest my enemies say, I have prevailed against him, and those that trouble me rejoice when I'm removed. But I have trusted in thy mercy. My heart shall rejoice in thy deliverance or salvation. And then the final verse says, I will sing unto the Lord because he has dealt wonderfully or bountifully with me. Now let's look at this for just a moment. Uh, in verse number 1, uh, David feels like he has been forgotten, that he is alone, that God has even hidden his face from him. He cannot be found, or perhaps the Hebrew idiom is that God has rejected me. And so this is perhaps the most disturbing thing about the psalm. Now, I want you to see something very important in verse number 1, that David is brutally honest in prayer. There's no pretense, no religious pietism. He is being very brutal, very honest with God. In fact, it's a complaint. Now, that might surprise you that you can complain to God, because most of the time we think of complaining as wrong and sinful. But I want you to think about something. There is a sense that there is a complaint of faith, and there is a sense where complaint is sinful. For you remember back in the wilderness, so oftentimes the Israelites had murmured and complained against God and were warned not to do that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. But I want you to see a difference here between David and those folks back then. David, in his complaint, turns to God. He speaks to God. He prays to God, while in the wilderness, when they were complaining and murmuring, they were turning against God. I have said, and I want you to remember this, that in prayer we can go to God with anything. We need to go to God in reverence and have the proper attitude, but you can go to God and pour out your feelings before Him. So I want you to understand, it's so important to be honest with God. We ought not to pretend when we're praying and that everything is okay and that we just sort of understand things. If you notice here, he's saying, how long? You see, when you think about the problem of verse 1, some people have quit praying. I mean, they just quit praying because they think that delay means denial, that God doesn't care. He doesn't answer prayer. You tried it. It didn't work. You prayed prayers that, as far as you know, there has not been any answer to them. And so we have theological problems with prayer sometimes because of how our thinking is about prayer. Have you quit praying? Or is prayer really a very vital, important part of your life? Now, I just want you to remember something, because we're going to expose the text later in a little bit more depth, but I want to encourage you to keep on praying and to be honest when you go to God in prayer. If you're sick about something, if you feel abandoned by God, think about it. He's going to God and he says, God, you haven't come through. It's been too long. I don't understand why. And you may even think about, doesn't God really understand my circumstance? Does he really understand? Does he not know that hope deferred brings sickness to the heart? I mean, that's in his own word. And so we got to be honest. I think you got to be honest with God and say, God, I don't understand. And God, I don't know how you could allow this to happen. I think we pour out our heart to God with some honesty. And I just want you to see that is so often the way that David would pray. He didn't pray some pious prayer that was in a temple that was just wanted to sound good. He went to God with just raw nerves and raw honesty. So the theological problem, of course, in verse 1 that we have sometimes, it just seems too long, and God hasn't answered, and we might really even question God, do you really care? How could you really care if you allowed this to happen? We got to be honest with God, and I don't think that there's any other way you can do it. Now, verse number 2, notice the problem now is inward, and this sometimes becomes a real big problem. Now, I know there's a lot of folks out there talk about the benefit of prayer inwardly, that it benefits you subjectively, but sometimes there's a problem with all that psychology, you know. So what he says in verse 2, I want you to see this. It's translated two ways, depending on what version you have. The first part of it says, how long shall I take counsel with my soul? Now you think about this. You're trying to get yourself out of a mess on your own. You're trying to figure it out. You've come up with all kinds of plans. This plan didn't work. That plan didn't work. And all of a sudden you say, this has been going, I haven't been able to get an answer. I can't find out a way myself to get out of it. And so your advice that you're giving to yourself, the thoughts that you're giving to yourself just haven't worked out. And it just brings all kinds of frustration. You don't know how you're ever going to get out of it. You tried about everything that you can think of. Now notice the other way it's translated, wrestle. Now I think this is a good translation here. Oh, how long have I wrestled? You know, and you begin to doubt and you begin to wonder if the problem is that God didn't answer me because of my sins, or God hasn't answered me because I haven't had enough faith. And you go through all that wrestling about it. So you can see the inward problem. And I believe there's a lot of people, if they were honest, have some inward problems with prayer. They don't believe that prayer either works, or they just don't believe that things are ever going to work out. And so here you see the problem number one is you having a problem with God. God, you haven't answered that. You haven't gotten me out of this. And then the problem number two is you couldn't figure it out yourself, and you may have given up. Verse number 3, he says, consider me, O God. Now I know I can just say from a preacher's perspective that God does really care. You got to understand that God really cares, and he even says himself, cast your burdens upon me because he cares for you, 1 Peter 5:7. So God does care. I'm just giving you that truth for a moment, but you may not think he really does. And what David is saying here in verse number 3, God, consider me, O Lord, my God. I want to talk about that personal relationship. You know, in personal relationships, you got to be honest, don't you? And so you see David, when he's praying to God, he's not just praying to the God of the universe, the God of all creation, the God who made us, but he's talking to my God. So there's that personal relationship, and that's why it's so difficult sometimes, you see, that a person feels abandoned. By the way, you don't feel abandoned in your relationship to God if you don't have one. That's where the problem comes in. When you have a relationship with somebody, and now you feel like they haven't come through, and they have hidden from you, they turned their face from you, they have rejected you, they don't want anything to do with you, they've hidden their face enemies from you. That comes out of that relationship. And that's why sometimes people quit praying, because they just don't have that personal relationship to God. They only pray when they need to or when they're pressed to do it. And I'm trying to build, as we go through our lessons here in Psalms, that you build that personal relationship with God, and you be just down to the earth, down to the dirt, honest before him. And if you're struggling with things, you tell the Lord you're struggling with that. He understands, he knows, he made you. And now verse number 4, on the outward circumstance, he talks about the enemy. Now there's a lot to say here, because you can talk about enemies that are real enemies. There are people against you. There are people who oppose good. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. So there can be really literally enemies or adversaries who are against you, who are making your life miserable. Why, they can even be in your own household. Now listen here. Sometimes the Bible uses enemies in a figurative sense. For instance, in 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about the last enemy is death. And so whatever, if it's figurative or it's metaphorical, we all have enemies in life. That's the way life is. You're going to have trouble. Somebody's going to cause you some trouble. And that's life. That's what life is sometimes. It's not all on the mountaintop, as you all really know. Now he's saying, now it seems like, Lord, answer my prayer, lest the enemy prevail or triumph over me, and against him who trouble and rejoice that I'm removed. It brings joy to them. They like to see you stumble. Listen, let me tell you something. You may have experienced this, but there are people out there that don't want you saved. They're trying to undermine the gospel. They don't believe the gospel. They're carnal minded. They're more secular than they are spiritual. Your foes can come from within the home, in the church, or out on the battlefield of life. And there are people who do not want you to be saved. There are people who do not want you to succeed. And what David is saying here, God, deliver me, so they do not prevail. Now I want to say a few things else about that at a later time. Now, verse number 5. Now, look at this. Here's the turning point. You remember, as you begin, David is depressed, and he's sort of disoriented about some things. And, when you get to verse number 5, he says, I have trusted in thy mercy. Now, that word's a great word. You may have loving kindness or unfailing love or steadfast love. And the idea, of course, there is that you can trust in God because he deeply loves you, and he has this covenant love with you. You can trust him. He'll keep his promises. So he's looking at his past. See, now he has a relationship with God, and God has delivered him. And so he's looking back at that, and it causes him to rejoice. Now, he's not rejoicing in the beginning. And let me just suggest to you, maybe the circumstances have not changed. Maybe the enemy's still out there on the field. But you see, when he begins to think about God's unfailing love and how he can trust in him, that all of a sudden becomes the most important thing. And the circumstances may not have changed. Now notice verse number 6. And I will sing to the Lord. Again, I don't think he felt like singing at the beginning of this prayer. This prayer only takes about 4 or 5 minutes. That's about all it takes. Sometimes you think you got to have a long-winded prayer. Yet this is a very short prayer. And don't think that's going to happen in the pulpit. When we have a short few verses, you're getting a short sermon. Just throw that in there for a moment, because this prayer has a lot of depth, and we're going to talk about it tonight just a little bit. Now, I will sing unto the Lord. And by the way, I didn't mention this in the beginning, but understand these psalms, these Hebrew hymns were used in worship, and this was a prayer, you see, where it's interesting, I think, because this was a prayer as a hymn that was sung in the worship service, and it wasn't cut out, even though the writer felt that he'd been abandoned by God. Isn't that interesting? Because all the pop songs and the popular songs all have to be positive, but I think sometimes, we ought to look at these Psalms of Lament. By the way, about 1/3 of the Psalms in the 150 are Psalms of Lament. man, facing difficulties in life. That's reality. And they would sing this hymn, this song in the worship service. And it's important to note that because, if we read in the Bible, we would probably censor that if we wrote the Bible ourselves. But he's giving us reality. Now, let me finish it. I will sing unto the Lord because he has dealt wonderfully with me. I want you to understand, here's a man that knew the Lord, and in prayer, that's our journey. To know the Lord in prayer, the prayer of faith, turning to God no matter what. I think these prayers can be such an encouragement to us, to you, and to me, and to build our prayer life. Let me suggest again, just in closing, that as we go through the Psalms and these prayers, these great prayers of David, when he's depressed, when he's angry, when he feels God has abandoned him, he always turned to God. And I think that if you'll put these in your diaries and use them as an outline, you get them in your own words in your own circumstance or situation. But these prayers can be a tremendous help as we begin to learn to pray and that our prayers become worthy of God. So that's the lesson today, and we'll see you tonight about 7 o'clock.